I will I will present to you about students with special educational needs. Mm, In um, Firstly, my name is Zahira binti Zulkifli 1621810. Okay, I will continue with my presentation with three people on the margins. The first person is Phyllis Whitley. She was a girl from city of Boston. She was a girl and was sold into slavery in the city of Boston in colonial America. And when she was 17, she had taught herself to read and write and had developed special love and talent for poetry. Her owner was a wealthy businessman and sought to improve his reputation by publishing her poem. Um, but unfortunately, he encountered stiff resistance from publishers because few people at that time believed Africans to be capable of the thought and imagination needed to write poetry, which means that they are skeptical and inclined to think that it was fake. And then the wealthy owner assembled a tribunal of 18 prominent judges to prove that to assess the young woman's mental capacity. Mm. After doing a cross-examining, after doing a cross-examination, they come to the decision that Mrs. Whitley was, after all, capable of writing poetry. Kita beroleh kemenangan yang pertama. And the second person, named Helen Keller, lost her sight and hearing as a result of illness during infancy. Sight and hearing as a result of illness. In spite of her disabilities, Helen devised a language of gestural signs for communicating with a tutor. As I know that the language that she used to communicate with the tutor is by touching the tutor's voice box, which is interesting. And she was soon using Braille to study both French and Latin. And at 10, she wrote and published a short story. Unfortunately, she also received a skeptical views. The prominent educators accused her of plagiarizing others' writing and merely parroting others' ideas without understanding them. And after that, a panel was assembled um, this time the panel were professional experts about disabilities to determine whether Mrs. Keller was in fact capable of writing what she published. And lastly, the panel decided that she was indeed capable, though only by a slim margin, which is 5 judges versus 4. In 1978, Sue Rubin was born with a disability that limited her speech to disordered bursts of sound and occasionally echoing phrases of other people. By that symptom, she was labeled autistic and assumed to be profoundly retarded. With the support and encouragement from her mother and others, however, she learned to type on a keyboard without assistance. And on her 13th age, she can communicate effectively and able to go to school. Since then, she has made many presentations about autism at conference and and edited a book about autism on 2005. The common things about these three people is that all the three was defined by society as disabled intellectually, although they receive variable of discrimination. And since the time of Phyllis Wheatley, North American society has eliminated slavery and made some progress at reducing certain forms of racism. In 1954, the United States Supreme Court ruled that public schools should not be segregated by race. And in doing so, recognize at least legally the intellectual competence of African Americans, as well as the moral obligation of society to provide all citizens with the best possible education. For the right and competence of persons with disabilities to be recognized legally, events and trends beginning in the 1970s have begun to make it happen. since the 1970s. mm, Political and social attitudes have moved increasingly toward including people with disabilities into a wide variety of regular activities. Mm, In the US, the shift was illustrated by the federal legislation that was enacted during this time. The legislation partly stimulated the change in attitudes, but at the same time, they partly resulted from the change. Three major laws were passed that guaranteed the rights of persons with disabilities. Hmm. The first is Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Hmm. This act um, require that programs that receive federal funding of any kind, the programs are not allowed to exclude children or youth with disabilities, and they have to find reasonable ways to accommodate the individual's disabilities. Then we go to the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 or ADA. Hmm. It is stronger than the previous provision. This act extend the Rehabilitation Act to all employment and jobs, not just those receiving federal funding. It also especially requires accommodations to be made in public facilities, such as with bus, restroom, and telephones. Mm. And lastly, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act or IDEA or something like that. The act was actually first passed in 1975 and had been amended several times until 2004 in this book. In the 2004 form, the law guaranteed the following rights related to education for anyone with a disability from birth to age 21. The first is free appropriate education. Individual or individual's family should not have to pay for education simply because the individual has a disability, and the educational program should be truly educational, not merely caretaking or babysitting of the person. Mm. Second is the due process. In case of disagreement between individuals with disability and the schools or other professionals, there must be a procedures for resolving the disagreement that are fair and accessible to all parties. Next is fair evaluation of performance in spite of disability. The test or other evaluation should not assume test-taking skill that a person with disability cannot reasonably be expected to have, such as holding a pencil, hearing or seeing questions, working quickly or understanding and speaking orally. Evaluation procedures should be modified to allow for these differences. This provision of the law applies both to evaluations made by teachers and to school-wide or high-stakes testing programs. Next is the education in the least restrictive environment. Education for someone with disability should provide as many educational opportunities and options for the person as possible, both in the short term and in the long term. This means that to include the person in regular classroom and school activities as much as possible, though often not totally. Lastly, an individualized educational program. As we know that every disability is unique, the instructional planning for a person with a disability should be unique or individualized as well. In practice, this provision has led to classroom teacher planning individualized program jointly with other professionals, like reading specialists, psychologists or medical personnel as a part of a team. How the ideal legislation affect the work of teacher, and then describe in more detail the disabilities. Not that. Firstly, the responsibilities of teachers for students with disabilities. The last legislation has affected the work of teachers by creating three new expectations. The first expectation is to provide alternative methods of assessment for students with disabilities. The second is to arrange a learning environment that is as normal or least restrictive as possible. And the third is to participate in creating individual educational plans for students with disabilities. Alternative assessment. In the context of students with disability, assessment refers to gathering information about students in order both to identify the strength of the student and to decide what special educational support, if any, of the student needs. By nature, all students have to undergo assessment. But for students with disabilities, such traditional or conventional strategies of assessment often seriously underestimate the student's competence. Some of them may have trouble holding a pencil, hearing a question clearly, focusing on a picture, and marking an answer in time even when he or she knows the answer. Concentrating on a task in the presence of other people or answering a question on the pace needed by the rest of the class. Hmm. Naturally, teachers will assume that these skills can can be learned by them with just a modest amount of coaching, encouragement, and willpower. But for it might be enough for a normal student to be said something like remember to listen to the question carefully. Unfortunately, for students with disability, a command like this may not work and may even be insensitive. Same like a student with visual impairment does, however, visual impairment does not seem to be reminded to look closely at what I am writing on the board, as doing so will not cause the student to see the chalkboard more clearly. Though the reminder might increase the student's anxiety and self-consciousness. Hmm. Um, there are a number of strategies for modifying assessment in a way that attempt to be fair and at the same time recognize how busy teachers usually are. One is to consider supplementing conventional assignment or tests with portfolios, which are collection of a student's work that demonstrate a student's development over time and which usually include some sort of reflective or evaluative comments from the student, the teacher, or both. Another is to devise a system for observing the student regularly, even if briefly, and informally recording notes about the observation for later consideration and assessment. A third strategy to recruit help from teacher assistants who are sometimes present to help a student with a disability. The assistant can often conduct a brief test or activity with the student and later report on and discuss the results with you. I think Malaysia should as well adapt this, because some people with cerebral palsy, for example, may want to receive the same educational curriculum with the others, but his disabilities may hinder him from getting the success as what others perceive as success is, because some people's achievement are different. So the cerebral palsy student may improve a lot in his own pace, and the improvement should be evaluated as well to be fair with him. And I will end this presentation with Assalamualaikum.